The sound of the gate locking echoed louder than it should have, a sharp metallic click that told me something was very wrong. I stood there, groceries in my hands, staring at the steel bars now sealed shut in front of my own driveway. A bright orange notice was zip-tied to the gate, flapping slightly in the afternoon breeze, as if it were proud of itself. That was the moment I knew the HOA had crossed a line they wouldn't be able to step back from. I read the notice slowly, twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't misreading it. Property access temporarily suspended due to compliance review. No warning. No phone call. No meeting. Just a lock, a notice, and the assumption that I would quietly accept it. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, pretending not to stare, curiosity hanging in the air thicker than the heat. I tried the gate again. Locked tight. New chain. New padlock. Professional. Deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. I called the HOA office. Straight to voicemail. I emailed. Automatic response. I even knocked on the board president's door down the street. Curtains moved. Door stayed closed. That was when irritation turned into something colder. Calculated. You see, the gate they had just locked was something I knew better than anyone else. I had installed it years ago, before the HOA expanded its authority. Back then, it was just a simple access gate to protect my land. I paid for it. I maintained it. I designed the locking system myself. And most importantly, I never handed over full control. The HOA assumed they had power because no one had ever challenged them like this before. They saw a gate and thought ownership came with proximity. They saw a lock and believed authority followed. What they didn't realize was that I was standing there calm not because I was trapped but because I was waiting. By sunset, word had spread. A small crowd gathered at a distance. No one said anything. They just watched. Phones came out. Whispers passed between neighbors. Everyone sensed this wasn't going to end quietly. I set the groceries down, wiped my hands, and pulled out my phone not to call a lawyer, not to call the police, but to check something I already knew was there. One confirmation. One detail the HOA never bothered to verify. The gate wasn't just locked. It was still mine. By the next morning, the lock was still there, gleaming like a challenge. Overnight, the HOA had doubled down. A second notice had been added beneath the first, this one stamped with official language and bold lettering meant to intimidate. Unauthorized access will result in fines. They wanted me frustrated. Embarrassed. Pressured into compliance. Instead, I brewed coffee and sat on my porch, watching. Around mid-morning, the HOA president arrived with 2 board members. They didn't greet me. They didn't ask questions. They stood by the gate like it belonged to them, arms crossed, speaking loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. It was a performance. One meant to establish dominance. You can't access the property until the review is complete, the president announced, as if reading from a script. This gate is now under HOA control. I asked a simple question. Under what authority? That seemed to irritate them. Papers were waved. A binder appeared. Pages flipped aggressively. They quoted bylaws, amendments, sections I'd already read years ago. They spoke confidently, assuming confidence would be enough. What they didn't notice was the crowd growing behind them. Neighbors had gathered again, quietly forming a half circle. No one interrupted. No one defended the HOA. They just watched. You're welcome to appeal, one board member added, almost smugly. But until then, the lock stays. I nodded. Calm. Measured. That seemed to confuse them more than anger would have. They left shortly after, satisfied. Convinced the situation was over. As if power only moved in one direction. Once they were gone, I stood up and walked toward the gate, ignoring the whispers behind me. I didn't touch the lock. I didn't cut the chain. I simply examined it. The model. The brand. The mechanism. The way it had been installed. Exactly as I thought. The HOA had added their own padlock, but they hadn't removed mine. They hadn't even noticed it. Hidden within the housing, integrated into the gate's internal mechanism, was a master control point. One that couldn't be overridden by an external chain. They thought they had sealed me out. In reality, they had just locked themselves into a misunderstanding. I pulled out my phone again, not to make a call yet, but to document everything. Photos. Video. The notices. The lock. The crowd watching in silence. Because when you're about to flip control back where it belongs, you make sure everyone sees how it happens. And I knew the moment I used the key, the story would change. I waited until late afternoon, when the street was busiest and the HOA office had likely settled into its usual rhythm of assumptions. That timing mattered. Power doesn't like witnesses, and I wanted plenty of them. Neighbors were outside now, watering lawns, collecting mail, pretending not to watch while watching very closely. I walked back to the gate slowly, deliberately, with nothing in my hands. That alone drew attention. People expect confrontation to look dramatic. They don't expect calm. I knelt beside the gate housing and reached into a narrow panel most people never noticed. Years ago, when I installed the gate, I'd insisted on a dual control system. One visible lock for appearances. One internal mechanical override for maintenance and emergencies. It was perfectly legal, fully documented, and approved long before the HOA decided it wanted more control than it understood. I pulled out a small, worn key. Nothing fancy. No labels. Just metal and certainty. A few neighbors leaned in. Someone whispered, "What is that?" I inserted the key and turned it once. There was a soft click. Not loud. Not dramatic. But final. The tension in the air shifted immediately, like a held breath released. I pushed the gate gently. It swung open with ease, despite the HOA's brand new chain and padlock still hanging there, suddenly irrelevant. The crowd reacted before I did. Murmurs. A few surprised laughs. Phones came up openly now. No one pretended anymore. I stepped through the gate, stood on my property, then calmly swung it shut again from the inside. Another click. This time, the gate locked fully. From my side. That's when the HOA president's car screeched to a stop at the curb. She got out fast, heels sharp against the pavement, face already tight with anger. "You can't do that," she shouted, pointing at the gate. I stayed where I was. "Actually," I said evenly, "I can." She demanded to know how I'd opened it. Accused me of tampering. Threatened fines. Her voice carried. The neighbors heard every word. I didn't argue. I didn't explain yet. I simply asked, "Did you ever ask who controlled the gate mechanism?" Silence. She didn't answer because she already knew the truth and she hated it. The lock she'd trusted wasn't the lock that mattered. And the authority she assumed didn't extend as far as she thought. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared the night before. Permits. Installation records. HOA correspondence from years ago. All stamped. All signed. "Before you call anyone," I said, "you might want to read this." Her confidence cracked just enough for everyone to see it. The HOA president took the folder from my hands with visible reluctance, as if touching it might somehow make things worse. She flipped through the pages quickly at first, confident she'd find a loophole or a technicality to lean on. But the faster she turned the pages, the quieter she became. The street noticed. The crowd noticed. Silence has a way of spreading when certainty starts to collapse. One of the board members arrived moments later, slightly out of breath, clearly summoned in a panic. He leaned over her shoulder, scanning the documents. His expression changed almost immediately. Gone was the practiced confidence. In its place was calculation and concern. "What is this?" he asked, tapping a highlighted paragraph. "That," I said calmly, "is the clause you inherited when the HOA absorbed the neighborhood." The clause was simple. Almost boring. It stated that any privately installed infrastructure predating HOA jurisdiction remained under the control of the original owner unless explicitly transferred in writing. No transfer existed. There never had been. And the gate, despite their assumptions, was infrastructure. The president looked up at me, voice lower now. "You didn't mention this." "You didn't ask," I replied. A murmur rippled through the neighbors. Someone laughed quietly. Another neighbor nodded, as if a long-held suspicion had just been confirmed. The president tried to recover. She straightened her posture and raised her voice slightly, attempting to reclaim authority. "We'll need to review this with legal," she said. Until then, I interrupted, still calm, "you have no authority to deny me access. And every minute this gate stays locked on your orders is documented." That stopped her completely. She glanced at the phones pointed in her direction. At the neighbors who weren't leaving. At the gate that now clearly answered to me, not her. Power looks very different when it's being watched. After a long pause, she gestured sharply to the board member. "Remove the notice," she said through clenched teeth. He hesitated, then did as he was told. The orange paper came down. The second notice followed. No announcements. No apologies. Just quiet compliance. I unlocked the gate once more and opened it fully. Not in defiance. In finality. The president didn't say another word. She got back into her car and drove off without looking back. The board member followed on foot, avoiding eye contact. The crowd lingered for a moment, then slowly dispersed. Nothing dramatic. No cheers. Just understanding. Because everyone there had seen it. Control hadn't been taken. It had been proven. By the next day, the HOA's tone had completely changed. No more bold notices. No more public declarations. Instead, I received an email written in careful, neutral language, the kind that tries to sound cooperative while quietly retreating. It stated that the situation was under review and that temporary access restrictions had been misapplied. No apology. Just distance. What stood out most was who the email came from. Not the president. Not the board. It was sent by the HOA's legal liaison. That alone told me everything. Later that afternoon, a white SUV parked across the street. Two people stepped out, both dressed plainly, carrying clipboards instead of authority. They approached slowly, eyes moving between the gate, my house, and the neighbors watching from their porches. They introduced themselves politely. No accusations. No threats. They asked if they could discuss the matter. I agreed, but only outside, by the gate. Visibility mattered. They asked how long I'd owned the property. When the gate was installed. Whether I'd ever signed an amendment transferring control. Each question felt less like an investigation and more like confirmation. I answered calmly and provided copies of the same documents the HOA president had struggled to read the day before. One of them nodded. "So the gate mechanism is entirely yours," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And always has been." They exchanged a glance. Not surprise. Acceptance. That's when one of them said something that shifted the moment from vindication to understanding. "This isn't the first time," he admitted. "The board has been overconfident lately." That word overconfident hung in the air. It explained everything. The lock. The notices. The assumption that no one would push back hard enough, or calmly enough, to expose the limits of their control. They assured me the HOA would not interfere with the gate again. No fines. No retaliation. No further reviews. They said it carefully, like a promise they wanted to survive scrutiny. Before leaving, one of them asked, almost casually, would you consider transferring control in the future? I smiled, just slightly. No, I said. They didn't push. They thanked me for my time and left. That evening, neighbors stopped by one. Not to celebrate. To ask questions. About documents. About clauses. About rights they'd assumed they didn't have. The gate stood open behind me, quiet and solid. And for the first time since the lock appeared, I realized this was never just about me being locked out. It was about reminding everyone who actually held the keys. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The HOA hadn't said a word publicly, but their silence was louder than any notice they'd ever posted. The gate remained untouched. No new locks. No warnings. No temporary measures. Just absence. That absence gave people courage. The first neighbor stopped me while I was checking the mail. He spoke carefully, like he didn't want his curiosity mistaken for rebellion. He asked how I'd known the HOA couldn't enforce the lock. I didn't lecture. I simply told him the truth that I'd read the documents when they were boring and irrelevant, not when they became weapons. He nodded slowly, as if filing that away for later. By the end of the week, more neighbors approached. Some casually. Some nervously. They asked about easements, access rights, architectural approvals they'd assumed were mandatory. A few admitted they'd paid fines they never fully understood. The pattern became clear. The HOA's authority thrived on certainty, not accuracy. The gate became a symbol. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was obvious. Everyone had seen it locked. Everyone had seen it open. And everyone had seen who decided when that happened. At the next HOA meeting, attendance doubled. I didn't plan to go, but I did. Not to speak. Just to sit. The board noticed immediately. The president avoided my eyes. Questions came fast. Specific. Informed. Clauses were mentioned. Sections cited. People weren't angry, they were curious. And curiosity is dangerous to unchecked authority. When someone asked about access enforcement, the president hesitated. She chose her words carefully. We're revisiting our procedures, she said. No confidence. No certainty. Just caution. That was when I understood the real impact of the gate. It hadn't embarrassed the HOA. It had exposed the boundary of their power. And once people see a boundary, they stop assuming it's endless. After the meeting, a board member approached me privately. Not hostile. Not friendly. Just honest. You changed the tone, he said. I shrugged. I didn't change anything, I replied. I just used what already existed. He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. That night, I locked the gate the same way I always had. Not to keep people out, but to remind myself that control, once proven, doesn't need to be displayed again. The HOA had learned their lesson. The neighborhood had learned a better one. 2 weeks passed before the HOA tried again, and when they did, it wasn't loud. There were no notices, no meetings, no public statements. This time, they chose subtlety. That alone told me they'd learned something, but not enough. It started with an email labeled maintenance update. Polite. Neutral. It explained that the HOA would be conducting routine inspections of shared access points across the neighborhood. The wording was careful, almost friendly. The gate wasn't mentioned by name, but it didn't need to be. The next morning, a truck I didn't recognize parked near the entrance. Two workers stepped out wearing reflective vests with the contracted maintenance company's logo. They walked straight toward the gate, clipboards in hand, confidence practiced but thin. I approached before they touched anything. "Can I help you?" I asked. They hesitated, then said they were instructed to inspect and, if necessary, update the locking mechanism to meet HOA standards. I asked who had given that instruction. They named the board. Not legal. Not the liaison. Just the board. I nodded and asked them to wait. Then I made one call. Not to the HOA. To the same legal liaison who'd been so careful with words days earlier. I explained, calmly, that contractors were about to alter privately owned infrastructure without authorization. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my voice. I simply described what was happening, in detail, while standing where everyone could see me. The response was immediate. Within minutes, the liaison called the contractor directly. I watched the workers' posture change as they listened. Shoulders dropped. Pens stopped moving. One of them glanced at me with an apologetic look. They packed up without touching the gate. No argument. No explanation. Just a quiet retreat. That afternoon, another email arrived. Shorter this time. It stated that the maintenance notice had been sent in error and that no inspections would be conducted on privately controlled installations. Again, no apology. But the message was clear. The HOA wasn't testing me anymore. They were testing whether anyone else would notice. Neighbors did notice. They always do. The truck. The call. The sudden reversal. Conversations started again, this time with sharper edges. That was when I understood something important. The HOA hadn't given up control. They'd simply learned they couldn't take it openly. But power that has to hide is power that's already shrinking. I locked the gate that evening and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. Not the tense quiet from before, but the kind that comes after boundaries are drawn and respected. They wouldn't try again. And if they did, it wouldn't be quietly. The final shift didn't come with confrontation. It came with paperwork. That was the part most people missed, because it happened quietly, away from the gate, away from the street, away from the crowd. But it was the most important moment of all. A revised HOA notice appeared in everyone's inbox one morning. No bold font. No warnings. Just an update to community procedures. Buried halfway down was a single paragraph explaining that privately installed access points would no longer fall under HOA enforcement unless ownership had been legally transferred. The language was careful. Neutral. Permanent. That clause hadn't existed before. Neighbors began texting me screenshots. Some added question marks. Others added a single word, "Wow." The gate wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew why the change had been made. Policies don't rewrite themselves without pressure. Later that day, the HOA president resigned. No announcement. No explanation. Her name simply disappeared from the board listing, replaced by interim chair. That detail mattered more than any apology ever could. Authority doesn't step down unless it knows it's been exposed. At the next meeting, I noticed something else. The tone was different. Questions were answered directly. Decisions were deferred instead of imposed. When someone asked about enforcement limits, the board referenced documentation instead of attitude. The gate had done its work without being mentioned once. After the meeting, a neighbor pulled me aside. She'd lived there longer than I had. She told me she'd never seen the HOA back down before, not like this. Not across the board. It wasn't just the gate, she said. It was how you handled it. I thought about that on the walk home. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't tried to embarrass anyone. I just stood still and let facts do what volume never could. That evening, I walked through the gate again. The metal felt the same. The hinge creaked the same way it always had. But the meaning was different now. It wasn't a boundary anymore. It was a reminder. The HOA never mentioned the incident again. No fines appeared. No follow UPS came. The gate remained untouched, respected by default rather than challenge. Control didn't change hands because someone lost. It changed hands because someone proved where it already belonged. And once that's done, there's nothing left to argue about. Months later, the gate is still there. Same steel bars. Same quiet hinge. Same lock that started everything. Most days, people pass it without a second glance, and that's how I know the story is truly over. Power struggles only feel loud while they're happening. Once they're resolved, they fade into routine, where they belong. The HOA operates differently now. Notices are softer. Language is cautious. Decisions come with references instead of threats. They don't test boundaries the way they used to, not because they suddenly became kind, but because they learned something expensive. Assumptions are risky when someone is paying attention. Every so often, a new neighbor moves in and asks about the gate. Not directly. Casually. "Wasn't there some issue with access a while back?" they'll say. I smile and give them the short version. Enough to inform. Not enough to relieve it. What matters isn't the lock or the key anymore. It's what the situation revealed. Most control exists only because people believe it does. The moment someone calmly asks why, the illusion starts to crack. I never became an activist. I never joined the board. I didn't need to. The lesson traveled on its own. People read their documents now. They ask questions at meetings. They pause before complying automatically. That shift didn't require rebellion. It required proof. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'll close the gate and stand there for a second longer than necessary. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. I think about how easily the situation could have gone differently if I'd panicked, or argued, or tried to force my way through that first lock. The outcome wasn't shaped by strength. It was shaped by restraint. The HOA never apologized. I never expected them to. What they did instead was more valuable. They adjusted. They stepped back. They left the gate alone. That's how you know control has changed hands for real. When no one needs to announce it. The neighborhood feels quieter now, but not in the uneasy way it did before. It's the kind of quiet that comes from clarity. From knowing where lines are drawn and trusting that they'll be respected. The gate opens when I unlock it. It closes when I choose. No one questions that anymore. And every time the lock clicks into place, it reminds me of one simple truth. I was never locked out. They just didn't realize who controlled the gate.